Dr. Carla Fowler is an MD, PhD, and elite executive coach. For the last decade, she's been a secret weapon for scores of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other senior leaders. Her unique approach combines the latest research from performance science with timeless best practices to help top performers level up and achieve their goals. She founded THAXA, a boutique coaching firm where the fields of strategy, productivity, and psychology intersect. Since its inception in 2013, THAX's scientific approach to individualized coaching has attracted a devoted client base of dozens of executives at firms ranging from Fortune 500 technology companies to venture backed startups to innovative nonprofits. Carla, welcome.
Hey, Mike. Great to see you.
And I've got to ask first, where does THAXA come from? That it's an interesting name.
Yeah, so THAXA means a task in Latin. And I picked it because as I was starting my coaching firm, I was thinking a lot about performance science. And one of the first principles of performance that I can ever remember understanding clearly in my life was fifth grade. And it was that really difficult things can be broken into simpler pieces and that almost all big challenging goals, that is how one can approach it. And so to me, part of the role of a coach is that you help people break down whether it's like behavior change or things they're trying to build skill and you help them break it down, right? Because when we're trying to think about the whole picture all at once, of course it can be overwhelming. If you're picking challenging enough goals, it will almost certainly be. So that's why I picked THAXA as the name of my firm.
Love it. Love it. So, first question I always ask after all, this is the Better Leadership Team show. So, the first question I always ask is about leadership teams. From all of your experience with leaders, what do you believe is the one most important characteristic of a great leadership team?
I like that you asked this question. And it was fun to look back at some of your episodes and see, like, oh, yeah, what do other people think about this? Because we all have these different experiences. And as I thought about it more and more, it's sort of two parts. The first thing is that I think it's really important when a leadership team can be very clear and articulate how the team wins, right? And so you could think about that as like having real clarity that is shared with the team and also people like who roll up under that team, like where everyone knows what are our objectives? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? If we're all playing a game together, how do we score? And also how am I contributing to that? And so that piece about really team clarity and providing that clarity, because again, often the leader is the person who needs to do that, or that leadership team needs to be in alignment on that. But the other piece, then I said, okay, well, but where does that come from? Because this is something I think about a lot. And I think the characteristic is it's often leadership teams that take time to think, that are not just always in meetings executing as leaders, but they are really working to say, I need time to independently get mental clarity so that when I'm showing up with the leadership team, with the teams that roll up under that, that I'm really clear. So that's
I
what I
love
think.
that. I love that. And I think that when I think of taking time to think, some of that happens outside of meetings. And I think in the best meetings, that also happens in meetings. And interestingly enough, I was just with, and I just wrote a social media post on this, is I was with a team and I want to try to not share too much and kind of protect the innocent and protect the guilty. But I was with a team who has a CEO that tends to the dictatorial side
Mhm.
and can get frustrated by too much debate and too much brainstorming and likes to, this is the answer, let's just go do it. And I met with the leadership team recently without the CEO.
Mhm.
And it was amazing how the leadership team was freed to think and perform at a whole different level because they were now free to think together with each other. So I think some of that thinking happens before the meeting, but some of it happens within the meeting.
I
So I love that.
Mike, I'm so glad you brought up that point because it actually very few things are only one thing, right? Like where, oh, you just have to do this one thing and then everything will come together. And what I love is you've brought up the synergy between like having that thinking time outside of a meeting that really primes our brain, but that there's also thinking that can only be done together. That because again, very few things in a company are a single player game. You need buy in, you need to have some peer relationships, you need to get input from other people who see things from a different angle. But if we're all prepared when we show up for that meeting and we kind of have clarity about what we think, we are so much better prepared then to work together in good ways and then do that collective thinking. So I think you brought up such a great point there. Love it.
Thank you. So where I want to transition into, Carla, like what you do and your thoughts on performance science is, and interestingly enough, this is the through message of my new book that just went to the publisher for the first draft. So depending
Excellent.
on
Congrats.
when you might be listening to this, maybe the new book's out, maybe it's not out yet. But the whole driving message is that the number one driver of profit growth is people growth.
Mm,
And what I want to focus on with you is that idea of people growth and what we need to do as individuals to grow as people, for ourselves, for the team, for the company. And in your introduction, I talked about the idea of performance science. Define that for us. What is performance science?
Yeah, great question. So I think about performance science as the multidisciplinary field of study of what helps human beings perform at a high level. And its origins are much more in the physical realm. So we obviously thought about performance a lot in terms of athletics or, that physical performance, but it grew into sort of places where we saw some crossover, right? So the military or the operating room, where it was like, well, okay, there's both a mental element of these arenas, but there's also still kind of a craft or a physical component. And then, of course, like business and our commercial world was like, well, we are interested in performing at a high level. So how does this, come into our arena as well? But I think there are lots of different places that these ideas come from about what helps us perform at a high level. Comes from like the study of even just our physiology, like the biology of it all. But there is also the contributions from our business schools or like the study of strategy. How should we think about strategy? Or how can we think about psychology? All the work on mindsets or confidence or motivation, right? Whether that's for an individual or for a team. And then there's also the whole productivity movement, right? How do we be really effective or efficient at executing on things? And how does that relate to how our brains work? So, lots of different contributors. And so, it is a noisy field. And that is, of course, always a downside. Lots of ideas. But of course, one of the roles then of coaching, using that as a basis, has been to say, well, we have to distill from this, what do people most need to know? I mean, if blueberries are a superfood, well, that's great, but that's probably not the thing that's going to be most important to help me, ace this presentation I have to give later. So, that's just a silly example, but I think we can get overwhelmed with information. And I do love science, but I also have always been someone who likes applied and very practical science. So, how do you take stuff out of academia and like give it to people in a way that they're like, "Oh, okay, I see how I can use this and I see my performance improve."
So,
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 that's
so,
what I
is,
think about the field.
yeah. So, love where you went. And as a way to simplify it, what do high performers do differently from everybody else? So and the answer probably comes from, to your point, not just eating blueberries, but probably doing some other things as well. But how do we bring it all together to something somebody could implement? What's different about high performers?
Yeah. This is a great way to approach things. And so we can both look at it from like, what do people do? And then what is often the mistake we can run into that we want to avoid? So, one of the first things that high performing people do is that they have a sense, well, actually, a sense, but also they practice being focused. Like, in fact, being like brutally focused. Because one of the biggest constraints that we all have is we have a certain amount of time, but this also comes into we have a certain amount of resources often within the business world. And we really have to think about how do we get the most impact out of ourselves, out of our time, and out of our resources, and out of our teams. So, like team attention is a limited resource, for example. So, one of the first things is that I think high performing people start from the assumption of, I am not going to do it all. Like, that is, we can just accept that as fact. So now, as I start to think about my performance, I'm not approaching it from the standpoint of, how do I try to do everything? Which often, by the way, roots people down the productivity like wormhole. And I love productivity, but what if you've ever seen this, like the person who is so busy running around looking for that like extra 1 minute saved, but isn't necessarily like getting all the impact they could. Like there's too much energy sent into trying to do more things versus from a high performance standpoint, asking the question, how do I improve my performance by being selective?
I love
So,
that. And the 2 words that I've used is to try to drive this point home because I love this point is, uh, being efficient versus effective. And I've
yeah.
always said efficient is doing things right. What are all the things you do and do it the right way and be most efficient? Effective is doing the right things. And
Mhm.
it sounds like the idea of brutal focus is more focused on that doing the right things versus how do we just get more effective with the 1,000 things we're doing.
Yes, I agree 100%. And actually, this is kind of what's at the root of strategy. In some ways, what strategy is asking at a basic level is to say, what are the most important things that we are going to do to achieve the goal or the objective we have? What is most important? What are the right things out of all the things we could do? And thus, it also says, okay, and then what are all the things we're not going to do? Because there's going to be a lot of those. And so that's one of the first things. And of course, when we are running around trying to do it all, or where our teams are trying to do it all, we risk burnout. We also risk working really hard and not seeing results that feel commensurate with our effort, because we really diluted everything we're doing. So, again, there are lots of great reasons to be focused. And I think one of the best tools, like if we were going to look at that, it's great to say, okay, I need to be focused, but Carla, what do I do? And this goes back to where we started, which is I think one of the tools of focus is actually creating time for yourself to think and ask yourself the questions about what are we trying to accomplish? Either what am I as an individual trying to accomplish, or what does my team need to accomplish? And then also then asking the question, what is actually most important, or what are the most potent drivers for us of this thing? And spend some time with those questions. They tend to not have easy answers, but that's okay because part of the benefit of thinking is both trying to work towards an answer in the moment, but as we said, it's also priming your brain so that in for future conversations or even like a week later in the shower, you have an idea where you're like, oh, wait, I am now connecting these two dots. And I think we're overly invested here and we need to actually start investing over here, for example.
So it's interesting because, I work with teams all the time to help them prioritize what's most important for the company. But
Awesome.
but where we're focusing now, which is so important, is or where I want to focus is that individual, right?
Mhm.
So yes, they're an individual, maybe the CEO, maybe the VP of sales, whatever your title is. But yes, the company has a vision. The company has maybe 3 big priorities for the year, for the quarter. But the question with that think time is, you know, what's most important for me?
Mhm.
Which part of that is about the company and part of it may be about your own it may be about your family or it may be about your own mental sanity.
Right. Or how you do your best work. Again, people get their best performance. There's some individual variety to that, right? Or variability. And so having that time to process company goals, but also say, yeah, what's my part of that? Where do I stand to most impact that thing? What could I contribute? What's going to set me up to do that? What do I need? Maybe what resources or support do I need? There are all sorts of questions then that you can kind of mind map off of that to then understand. what might be most important. And sometimes we don't know the answer, but it sets us up to say, well, who else could I talk with to talk through some of the uncertainties maybe that I'm dealing with or the ambiguities to help me answer that question. But we often don't go have that conversation if we haven't had some time to kind of prepare and almost identify and set up some of the questions. So thinking time doesn't have to be all about answers. Some of it is priming our brain, some of it is preparing us to see where we need to go do some learning or get some other viewpoints. But it just has such a valuable role. That is what I see as the most important tool of focus is like that time to not be doing and to not be in a meeting, but to actually say, how do I think, right?
Yeah, and how often, and I'm sure there's no one right answer to this, but what's been your experience with, is this, am I thinking, is it about every morning? What's most important today? And what are the drivers? Is it every month? Is it every quarter? Is it every year? Or is it all of those things? How often should we be setting aside that thing time to answer that question?
This it depends a little bit on what people's situation is, but I find that there can be some different roles for different kinds of thinking time. So, for example, I think it's great to actually proactively block some time on your calendar, like send a recurring calendar invite to yourself for like at a minimum an hour a week that is your time to like pause and really think deeply about whatever might be most important that's sort of happening. Again, I'm giving a very general answer, but most people have no thinking time right now. And so if you can get them to go 0 to 1, do that. And then you can start to say, all right, what are the benefits of this? What am I getting? And if I could use more, in what form would that be? Now, you brought up a daily thing, and one of the daily practices that I find is very useful that a lot of executives feel a sense of relief when they have it is it's like either putting your day to bed or waking your day up in the morning. And that can be like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, doesn't even have to be more than that. But it's a way to say, how is the day shaping up? What are my priorities for the day? What do I intentionally want to get done? Knowing that you're never going to get your whole to do list done. The nature of work is work keeps generating itself when you're successful. So, but it's really looking at, okay, what came into the inbox? How do I want to handle the almost always shifting set of priorities and schedule to deal with stuff that comes up in the moment. But it's a way where people don't feel like they immediately start reacting the moment they show up at work. And again, the reason I talk a lot about thinking time as the answer to your question about what makes a great leadership team is because I think those teams do have to react to what's happening, but we don't want to set ourselves up to always have to be in reacting mode. And that's where having even 15 minutes at the beginning of the day that you've blocked and you're like, I'm not yet in a meeting, I'm not yet doing work, but I kind of get my head on straight. I see what's coming. That is a way of saying, I start my day not in a reactive mode. I will almost certainly need to react at some point, but we can practice spending more time out of that. And I think that just really is a great thing for teams.
I love it. One of the things I do, and you're talking about 20 or 30 minutes in the morning, I think I take about 4. And what
Yeah.
I do, and I learned this from one of my coaches way, way back, probably 15 years ago. You had this grandiose term. He called it executive creation and decision making time.
Okay.
Just
Love it.
means think time is another way to say it. And what I do every morning is I will come up with what are the 2, 3, or 4 most important outcomes that
Yeah.
I'm committed to achieve that day. Not to dos,
Yep.
not I'm gonna have that meeting, it's I'm gonna close the deal.
Yes.
Not I've got a coaching call with a client, but I'm gonna help them solve that, this problem, whatever it is. But so that's an interesting way to think. So I've been doing that every morning for about the past
Awesome.
15 years. So it's great. So back to where we were talking about what high performers do differently. And the first practice is brutal focus. What's
Yes.
what's the next one?
So the next one is this is sort of related to a mistake that is very common. I have made it many times, and that is that Often when we're trying to do something or we're up against a challenge, we can be like searching around for some new idea. We are looking for a solution and we think we don't have it yet because we're like, well, this just seems really hard. We keep searching for the hack or the silver bullet versus getting started with a good or decent idea that we already have. We confuse knowing something with doing something, right? We're like, I just need to know the right thing. And when I know the right thing, then, everything will just happen. And so I think high performing people are very good at getting started with a decent idea and then building momentum with that. And yes, there is some figuring out that happens along the way, but they don't wait to know it all before they're going to do anything at all. And again, not because they have more sophisticated ideas. So my best example of a tool around this is I call it my 90-90-90 rule or tool. And it's just as an example to help people get going on things and really not get stuck in that, oh, I just need to like, there must be an easier way to do this and I just don't know it yet. So I'm going to wait to get started. So what the 90-90-90 rule is about is that when we're trying to learn something new or solve a challenge, often like 90% of people don't get started. Like this is where we get stuck. Most people get stuck before we start. The second 90 is that when we get started, what often happens for 90% of the people who do that is we quit too soon. So we do like make some efforts towards things, we try some different things, sort of doesn't get fully off the ground. And then we're like, okay, we fall off. The third 90 refers to like, okay, you got started, you kept going on it. But the third mistake we can make is that then 99% of the people who are still going never change up what they're doing. So they don't iterate or try something new. And I like this rule because to me it says, hey, there are only three ways we can fail, but there are a number of different paths by which we can actually succeed. And so what we have to do is try to not fall into one of those 90% along the way and just recognize where and when that might be happening. So, in terms of getting started on something, often even if we have, I like your 4 minutes in the morning, 4 minutes is enough to like sit with like some kind of post it pad and just say, what could it look like to get started? And just say, all right, is there something I need to learn? Okay, great. Like, what could the 0 to 1 look like? Could I, even listen to a podcast on this thing? Could I go talk to an expert, someone I know who's really good at this thing? How about I go talk to them? Right. What if it's something that has participation involved, what if I just went and did it once? Didn't worry about how it went, just like went and had the experience. But there are lots of ways we can get started. And often we need to think of a couple of ideas. We need to pick one and then we need to put it on our calendar.
I love that. And I'm thinking, and I want to ask you a question about this because I have a client and he will know who he is if he's listening to this. But, and I've dealt with a number of folks like this where to get started, he wants to make sure he's got all the answers, like the opposite of what you're talking about. He wants to make sure he's got
He
all the
wants to
answers.
skip to the
And
third
and
90.
and his
That's what I call this.
yeah, and his standard thing is, I have a question. I have another question. I have another question. And there are times I've said to him, okay, and he hates me when I do this, but there are times I've said, okay, you have 10 seconds to make a decision. 10. No, and you may because my point is, very often there's no right decision. There's only a decision. And then we execute on it and we zig and we zag. But how do you, other than helping people understand the 90-90-90 rule, is there another technique or another tool to help people who very often let perfect be the enemy of good?
Oh,
Do
question
how
my
do you get them off their butt to actually get moving when they're so hesitant to do that?
yeah. Well, this is where I draw on my science background, but everyone can use this tool. You do not have to be a scientist to use it. And that is, I teach people how to run good experiments. So we take it out of the performance realm because I think often when people are asking all those questions, it's because they feel like they need to show up and like on rep one or day one, they have to be perfect. They have to be performing at a performance level. But of course, no, I mean, whether it's the arts or whatever, that like people rehearse that many times before they're actually performing. And a lot of those rehearsals went sideways. So the thing about science that I love is it's a whole profession built around the idea of showing up at work every day not knowing the answer. And like the reason you have a job is because there are things you still don't know the answer to. You might have gotten the answer to the thing yesterday, but now your job is like, oh, well, now I need to figure out the next thing. And also, as a scientist, you run lots of experiments where the results were not like, I cured cancer. I mean, I'll be honest, I always had that dream when I walked into the lab every day in my past life. But, most days are not curing cancer. And so I like the framework of saying, how could we run an experiment about this? Because it takes it out of right and wrong. Did I get the right answer or did I get the wrong answer? And it says, what answers can I get? And what can I learn from those answers? Because one of the best pieces of advice that I got from my PhD mentor while I was doing that piece of training was I would sometimes come in and say, "Oh, I'm going to run this experiment." He would say, "Well, why are you going to run that experiment?" And it wasn't a rhetorical question. It was he wanted to understand like what is it I could learn from the experiment, whether it went one way or the other way. Like, what were you gonna measure? Like, what were the kinds of things that would be relevant to know? And I just like it because it takes us out of the piece of our brain that is binary and that is very performative and puts it into more of an analytical, exploratory, creative piece of our brain. And I think that just helps.
I
So,
love that. Is a
yeah.
big experiment, right? It's not like
Yes.
you screwed up that decision, now you're done.
Right.
No, now you get to run a different experiment. I love that way of
You get to
thinking.
show
That's
up
great.
again.
Alright, so
Um,
we've got brutal focus. We've got this idea of dealing with the uncertainty and moving forward anyway. What's the next thing that high performers do differently?
mm, yes, this is a good one. Okay. Um, There we talked about sort of the feeling of needing to perform. Well, one of the interesting things about performance is that performance is performative. And what I mean by that is high performers both are thinking about what are their results, but they're also thinking about what is the visibility of their results. Because it turns out that for things that are not as easy to measure fully objectively. So, for example, in the Olympics, well, it's less clear sometimes than we think, but regardless, it's usually pretty clear who won the race. I understand that there are any number of contested results that have happened, but at any rate, it's usually pretty clear. You time everyone and you watch the race, and it's like, okay, well, that person won. But most of life and most of business, and particularly like teams and operating in teams, we are producing results, but it is not always super objective in how we measure those results. And there's a great book. The author's last name is Barabasi, but it's called The Formula. And I love this book. He is a social scientist who studied success and separated out like what do our results have to do with success, but are there things beyond just the objective results? And he found that in these arenas where it was more ambiguous how you'd measure things, that the social network's perception of your results was a very important component of success, that it wasn't enough to just be producing great results. And so I think I often hear from people that they're like, well, I like, and these are humble, wonderful people who are like, well, my results should just speak for themselves. Like, I'm not super braggy. I'm not overly self promotional. And I just want to do great work and people will see my great work. And I both love like that, like, this is how people feel. But I also know that actually there is a lot of noise in the workplace and we need to make our results visible because that is actually part of how we help others get the most value out of us, get the most value out of our teams and what they're producing. And so I think this is an interesting area because sales or promotion is often an area, unless you are a salesperson and you love that, for most people, they don't like sales. In fact, for every person who's had a bad sales experience where someone tried to like push you to buy something that you didn't want, like we feel it can feel a little dirty. It can feel like, ugh, like I don't want to sell my result. But I think sales and the willingness to make visible what we can offer and the impact we can have is actually one of the most underlearned and underutilized and undervalued skill sets because we are always in the business of sales, selling an idea, selling some impact that we can offer. It's not just about selling a product or a service. So, this is an interesting piece about performance that I think we can often miss. Is I've almost decided to call it the fourth 90 in my 90-90-90 rule, which is once you're really up to speed and improving what you're doing, then you need to think about like who else cares about this? Who might be a stakeholder who could be impacted? How do I let those people know all the great things I'm doing and how I could help? Right? How could I help with their concerns?
So
Like
what
how
would
could
what
I
would
yeah.
what would be an example of that if, let's go back to the leadership team and
Mhm.
I am the, VP of marketing on the leadership team and I perform well. The last, email marketing campaign we did brought in 10 new marketing qualified leads and my goal was 5. So man, blew it away. And 3 of those folks became clients, big win from this new marketing campaign. What does it mean to literally, what does it mean to make that visible? How do I do
Yeah.
that? And how do I do that without it just looking or feeling like I'm tooting my own horn?
Yeah. Great question. And of course, there is an art to this, but some of the questions you could ask yourself before even going into the meeting where you're going to say this, if I'm the marketing director, some things I could ask myself are, okay, what are the implications of this for the team? Right? And it sounds like this is good news. So, generally, good implications. But one of the ways you can look at it is to think about okay, so we're bringing in more qualified leads. Like, what does that mean for the capacity of the sales department? Right? Who's going to like start to convert these leads? Or what does that mean in terms of like where else we could be looking or thinking about the marketing campaign and who might have an opinion on so I think there are a lot of ways where we can talk about the good news and sharing good news is not like I do not believe that's overly promotional. I think we can also think about who contributed. So that's always an important thing to bring up as well. Like the more that when you're in a leadership team, the understanding that we all depend on each other and that if marketing is winning, but sales is not winning in terms of like turning the great inbound into conversions, like then that's not a good scenario. So part of it is to recognize like, hey, how is this a win for everyone? If you're obviously your team participated, so it's always worth recognizing your team at the leadership level. That is an important piece. Because again, it's not like I did all of this. It's like, no, actually, my team executed really well and I'm proud of them. But then you can also think about like who else from the team contributed, like, sales like took those leads and converted them, like, good job. So you can recognize others. But the other thing, you can then start to ask questions so asking questions about like, hey, knowing this, what opportunities might this represent for all of us? Right? Or does this represent any challenges for all of us? And really starting to engage people in it to say, this isn't like, oh, this is my moment and my prize. It's, hey, when we have wins, we celebrate together, but we also think about what can we do with this together? What do we need to mitigate together? So those are some ways that just take it out of just the tooting my own horn context
Yeah.
and really put it into a let's win together as a team. But also it makes it visible. It's great for other people to know that, hey, your marketing team is doing awesome.
Yeah. And what I like about what you said is it goes beyond just the individual, look what I did. And
Exactly.
it's getting the team involved. It's what are the implications? And I was right before this interview, I was talking to one of my clients about, the idea, there've been some tough things going on. They haven't been winning a lot lately
Yeah.
as a company. But in those situations, it's really important to find the small wins because winning breeds more winning and losing could breed a losing feeling. feel like losers, and it's always going to be that way. And
Yeah.
morale goes down and it starts to become self fulfilling. So I like what you said because it's important to find those wins, not
Mm.
to toot your own horn, but to make sure the team owns it as well, and that winning is going to breed
Yeah.
more winning, and ultimately you create a winning culture that everybody benefits from. So
Yeah.
I love that. I want to talk a little bit about executive coaching. So
Sure.
beyond the idea of performance management and what some of those best practices are, coaching is one of those things, these days almost everybody's a coach, right? And but there are life coaches and there are executive coaches and there are sales coaches and I coach leadership teams which is different.
Yeah.
Help me understand, what is your flavor of executive coaching? What does that actually look like?
Yeah. Great question. And you are correct. I mean, it is a noisy field. I would agree. So, my flavor of executive coaching is that I work with individual leaders who are setting ambitious goals for themselves and for their teams. And I work with them to both help them use performance science, but also to really focus and have some time to think and a thought partner as they are working through like getting to those goals. And so I do this in a one-on-one setting. And again, there are roles for coaches in like teams as well. But in my sense, I do this one-on-one with leaders. And a piece of that is because I just know number one, it can be lonely at the top. And number two, it also can be hard to find and protect that time to really do some of that thinking. So just bringing it back to what we started this conversation with, that sometimes it is great to have a thought partner and someone to dialogue with. And in terms of like how I do the coaching, I took the noisy field of performance science and asked myself the question, what are the most important principles that we might want to be incorporating, like baking into a coaching process so that it just helps people use them all along the way as they're going towards their goals? And so, just as an example, we talked about brutal focus to start in our conversation. But one of the ways I start my coaching process is with a longer form session. So it is multiple hours, and we use that time to actually get set up and ask those brutal focus questions. So from a broad high level standpoint, what are the goals, right? What can we help them get some clarity? And they don't have to know the answers to these questions. Part of the coaching is to help them explore and say, okay, here are what my goals are, here are my team goals, and really get some clarity on like where are you aiming? And then we also ask the question like what is most important? Can we actually connect the dots, find some of those root drivers that are really the most potent ways you make impact towards those goals? And I love starting this way. I guess we also asked the third question, which we didn't talk about, which is what's extraneous? Like, what is actually distracting you or that is like really noisy, but actually doesn't matter that much? But we have to find a way to like deal with it or get it off the plate in order to move on to more important things. So that's the third question of brutal focus. But we start broadly using that time to set ourselves up for success because while I often think about performance science as having like a strategy bucket, an execution bucket, and like a psychology or a mindset bucket, what I know is if we can identify what some of those most important or right things are from the start, we set everything else up to go much more smoothly. And we do learn along the way. Sometimes something we thought was important, it turns out is less important than we thought. But because we sort of called our shot at the beginning, it helps us then really test that, push on that, and learn as we go along. So that is how I start. And that's one of the unique things that's not how many coaches will start, but I do start by really almost doing a mini strategic retreat for people at the beginning so that I really understand their landscape as well as they have that clarity that then again helps them set their teams up for success, helps them set their own kind of coaching process up for success. And then as we go along, generally our goal is to help them build momentum in those priority areas. And sometimes that requires some skill development. And I try to act as a resource. So, for good ideas for how to do things, new approaches, I'm constantly reading across the self development and business literature. So, That can span from how to think about a sales pipeline to, how do I build more confidence when I'm speaking publicly? So lots of different things that people might need. And I try to act as a resource, but I also act as a dialogue and a thought partner because sometimes there's not a best practice, but there might be a right answer or a good decision process for the client. So I also act to ask questions, help them get clarity. And then I think third role I often play is almost like a co-creator, which is like sometimes we need a safe place to and an intellectual peer to bounce ideas off of and sort of say, have both of us say, well, what if you tried it this way? Or what if you messaged it like this? What would that look like? What's the story you could tell about this element? And so sometimes it is nice to have someone else throwing ideas out there as part of a co creation process that then, of course, they as the client can sort of alter with what resonates and sort of say, "Oh yeah, I like that version. No, I don't like that version. Okay, let's aim that way." But so as a coach, part of my role shifts depending on what the situation needs, but I always approach things to say most challenges and problems have multiple angles of attack. So sometimes we need to approach it strategically and understand what's most important. Sometimes we actually need to approach it from a how do we just get you going and executing? Right? Sometimes we need to approach it from the mindset standpoint to say, what kind of perspectives or a different way of just thinking about this or feeling about this might really benefit you and kind of overcome the challenge that you perceive right now. So one of the things I love about performance science is it gives you those different angles to say there's not only one way to solve something that feels like a problem or feels like a challenge. And so I love just being able to, like, again, whatever people bring in, we can look at it from a number of different angles and pick the one that feels most appropriate.
Well, I am not an executive coach, but I am a giant fan of executive coaching. I've had coaches for God, it's probably almost 20 years now, and I've had the same coach for about, man, it's probably the last 12 or 13 years,
That's
who I'm in
awesome.
love with. He's so amazing for me. And, part of what my coach does for me is sometimes when I don't have the confidence I could do something, he lends me his confidence in me and boosts me up to get it
Yes.
done. And that's such an important piece. Carla, and this will all be in the show notes, but if people want to find out more about you and THAXA, more about coaching, where should they go to find that out?
There are a couple of great places. My website is probably the first resource, and that is at thaxa.com, THAXA. And then for people who are interested in performance science and want to follow along, I'm often having conversations or producing content about it. LinkedIn is a great resource, and I'm at Carla Fowler. So, again, if you have questions about coaching, the website has a great FAQ and you can message me through the site, but also LinkedIn is a great place to follow along.
Excellent. Well, I always say if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. Carla, thanks for helping us get there today.
Thanks so much, Mike.